Baccano's first episode is really awful. In fact, even though Baccano is a pretty highly regarded series, it might actually be one of the worst starts to a show I've ever seen. That might sound hyperbolic, but let me say this. There are countless anime with awful or boring first episodes, but usually those anime themselves were awful or boring as a whole. I've stopped watching countless anime before the first episode finished, and while I've actually finished Baccano, I did that at the behest of people telling me how great it was. Baccano had all the pieces to have a good first episode, and it's strange that the first episode is the clusterfuck that it is. So, if you want to tell me that Baccano's first episode isn't nearly that bad, and there's worse first episodes to shows that have the main character trying to molest his sister 30 seconds in, I'm not going to argue with that, because you're completely correct. That's absolutely worse than Baccano's first episode. But Baccano actually shows quality later on in the story, so relative to the show's ability, it is way worse in that regard. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's begin. I wanted to identify exactly what is wrong with Baccano's first episode and to break it down piece by piece. It does a handful of things correctly, but there's so much wrong with the first episode that I'm surprised I ever got into the show. I'm glad I did, as it's one of my 3 favorite shows, but that's no excuse to have such a failure to generate interest for the audience in the initial viewing. The first thing we see when we start at the show is the opening theme. In 90% of all shows, I wouldn't mention this. In fact, in most anime, the opening animation wouldn't even be shown in the first episode. While its function of introducing the characters is immediately obvious, as well as giving you an idea that an absolute ton of shit is going to be happening in the show, it actually manages to set up the first scene of the episode fairly nicely. Immediately after informing you of the sheer number of characters in the show, the first actual scene of the show features 2 characters, Carol and the vice president of the Daily Days, having a meta discussion about the events of the show, debating who the main character is of the story, and when the story technically begins. Without this scene, I'm pretty sure the show as a whole wouldn't work at all. Without the explicit knowledge that you're watching a show that completely ignores normal timelines and wants you to figure out and piece everything together yourself, the show stops posing an intriguing question about what has happened and instead would likely feel like it's just throwing a bunch of different scenes at a wall trying to be artsy. However, despite absolutely needing this scene and doing some good for the show, there's still some problems. It takes 1 minute and 40 seconds of time to go into a flashback where the 2 characters talk about an anecdote relevant to their conversation. You could, however, literally pluck this scene out of the episode in its entirety and not lose anything at all. Quick math, the total runtime of this episode without the ending credits is 22 minutes and 53 seconds, so this flashback, which is 1 minute and 40 seconds, takes up 9% of the episode's runtime. As I talk about how useless scenes are, remember how little it takes to eat up valuable time on the first episode. The only thing the flashback adds is the idea that you'll be skipping around time within the show, except it fails at helping the audience understand that. The show skips around completely at random, and yet the very first time we see this happen, the show explicitly tells you it's about to show you a scene from the past. This doesn't happen again for the entire show, giving you false expectations for how this is going to work. And finally, the scene ends with a few moments establishing Isaac and Miria, Cheslaw Meyer, and Firo as the mainish character. Also, while I don't want to go onto a huge tirade about what this episode should have been overall, I definitely want to point out that choosing Firo as the character to introduce the audience to in episode 1 is a terrible decision, and I'm not sure why they picked him. Anyways, on to the next half of the episode that contains everything wrong here and turns it into shit. Immediately we get thrust into a scene that is 4 minutes straight of these 2 dudes talking about mob families we don't know or care about, and events that no one can even begin to understand. And yes, it can be argued that that's the whole fun of Baccano, is figuring out where all these events fall into place, but the thing that's idiotic about this is that of all the characters in the show, they give you a first real introduction to the world to these 2 fuckers, who aren't even in the opening credits. They have no name, you have no idea what their relation is to anyone, and you have no reason to give a single shit about them, and you never will throughout the entire show. Past this, you get the Gandor family talking about how they've been hit, and Luck brutalizing some poor sod who you genuinely have no idea if he's done anything at all. Sure, this scene is slightly better than the one before it due to having characters that you know will actually have some importance, but despite having over half the episode to try and endear us to these characters, it gives us absolutely no reason to like these people. All we know for sure by the end is that people want these guys dead, they are absolutely willing to resort to violence and torture, and they're immortal. So not only are we given 2 reasons to not want to care about these people, we are also given information that makes these characters completely devoid of dramatic stakes. In fact, if we took the scenes of them without the scene of Carol explicitly stating Firo is the main character, I bet everyone would have assumed that this was the introduction to the villains of the series.
Alright, tell me something.
Stay back! Get away, you monster!
Old-timer, did you know that I'm Firo Procinezzo of the well-respected Martello family? Did ya?
Why is this how we meet our characters? We are explicitly told Firo's immortal and from a mob family right after Carol supposits that he might be the main character. Why are we eating up this crucial time in the first episode re-establishing these same facts again? Why not give new information that makes us like this guy? How about the moment when Firo runs toward a fire, mentioning that he wants to make sure no one is injured? Firo is one of my favorite characters in anime, but in this episode, I'm given nothing that endears him to me. The episode took up 8 fucking minutes to get to a point where it can actually start introducing characters instead of explaining the concept of the show and how confusing it's going to be, and it takes that time to establish nothing except that everyone is a criminal that kills people and that Firo is a badass. Since we're not given a reason to give a shit about Firo, let's take a look at what other characters we get introduced to. We have Isaac and Miria, and it introduces them as eccentric robbers and mildly hints that they're immortals. But why not actually show them being eccentric, like when they dome some mobsters over the head dressed as baseball players? And why does this second little scene pull out a character from the light novel that you will never see again? Eve Genoward gets introduced with one frame of her saying, "Dallas, where are you?" which inclines me to neither give a damn about her nor her brother, as I don't have much information aside from the fact that they're related and she misses him. Heck, since Baccano eschews normal anime style and goes for a more realistic approach, I can't even be inclined to give a damn on the fact that she's a cute girl like in most anime, because she doesn't even look that cute. Shawnee LaForet gets a single moment of her floating in the river on some luggage, which seems like a pretty pointless way to introduce her. It tells us nothing other than she survives the train. We're not introduced to her as a badass knife-wielding assassin, but rather as if she were a normal passenger of the flying pussyfoot that somehow survives. Except we've already seen her in the opening, which gives us a much better introduction to her character anyways. We also get to see this fucker on top of the train, which seems like a questionable decision, since the fact that this character is even a character at all is supposed to be a huge reveal. Sure, they don't give anything away, but once again, this is supposed to make me care about the characters of the setting, and this seems pretty pointless to reference a thing that won't come up again until much later in the show. This moment basically exists solely for second-time viewers. Overall, the episode fails to get me interested in most people mentioned, except for 2 characters. Let's take a look at Cheslaw Meyer and Lad Russo. For Cheslaw, we get 30 seconds total with him, and we get an intriguing description with the young man who suffers with a cursed destiny. We see his head blown the fuck off, and then we get to see him regenerate, completely unfazed, showing that he's got way more going on than just being a kid. And as for Lad, well, Lad is Lad frickin' Russo.
If I'd have known this is what would happen, I would have made absolutely sure to kill you sooner. If you like, I could kill you right here.
But Lad, you don't...
What's the matter, sweetheart? You saying you don't want to be killed by me?
This moment might not endear you to the character, but it's great for establishing him. And while I would bet almost anyone who watches the show is going to love him later on, it is pretty hard to convince an audience member that they're going to love this guy because of his clear psychopathic desire to just murder everyone. And what the shit happened to his arm is a perfectly valid question to otherwise get the viewer involved in what's happening with the character. Now, I know I'm talking positively about Cheslaw and Lad's spotlights in the show, introducing their characters, but what they really do is showcase how bad the rest of the episode fumbles introducing people. We had 10 minutes of Firo and Friends that was not endearing us to the characters at all. It didn't even work to get you curious about what events have happened. Most of the bits that we get that introduce a mystery aspect in the show are the bits about the flying pussyfoot, and even then the mystery isn't much more than what kind of bad things happen. If you ask me, Baccano's defining characteristic is its huge cast of interesting character. And if that's the case, how come by the end of this entire episode, there's only 2 characters at most that I'm likely interested in? And neither of those characters were given the giant swaths of screen time during this episode. Sure, there's other reasons to be intrigued by this show, like its meta discussion of its own events, which will certainly interest some people, or the fact that it's set in 1930s America with mobsters against a supernatural backdrop. But these aren't things that the writers and directors of the show themselves managed to accomplish. This was all based off of the light novel in the first place. The interest and intrigue of the episode comes from the most basic concepts of the show, and sure, being interested solely on the concept is pretty standard for anime. But if we had as many 1930s America mobster shows in anime as we do isekai shows, it would be really easy to make it clear how bad of a fuck-up this was of a first episode. Thank you everyone for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.